Dear Prime Minister, dear colleagues and friends, my name is Fløtten, and it's a pleasure to welcome you all to this international conference on European migration and asylum policies. The conference is a joint venture between the Norwegian Centre for Human Rights, the Nordic Institute of Migration and Refugee Policy, and Fafo. And we thank the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for giving us the opportunity to host this conference. A year ago, the refugee crisis was no doubt the most discussed subject in the Nordic countries. In 2015, more than 225,000 refugees applied for asylum in one of our countries. The influx of refugees to Europe hasn't been as massive as expected in 2016, but people are still coming in great numbers. The International Organization for Migrants reported this week that more than 300,000 migrants have crossed the Mediterranean so far this year. There are almost 4,000 deaths at the sea. 150,000 migrants are staying temporarily in Greek islands. More than 20,000 single minors have arrived in Italy. And this is happening as a number of European countries are closing their borders for illegal refugees, and Hungary recently rejected the European quota system. This is just some examples. The situation is definitely uncertain. And during last year, it became evident that the national and supranational institutions and regulation in force were not prepared to handle the refugee situation in a coordinated manner. European nations have now scrutinized and revised their migration policies and their migration control. The EU is discussing how Europe can manage its border and limit irregular migration at the same time as the Union lives up to its international commitments. And it's obvious that this is not the time to look for isolated solutions. This is a time for cooperation. We are thus happy to host this seminar, where experts from the Nordic countries will analyze the European refugee and asylum policies and discuss how we may reach joint solutions. And the future of refugee policy must be developed in the intersection between law and politics. We are therefore very glad and proud that Prime Minister Erna Solberg could join us today and that she agreed to open our conference. We know that the refugee situation concerns you deeply, and we will listen carefully to what you have to say. Please welcome the Norwegian Prime Minister Erna Solberg.
Thank you very much for inviting me to address today's conference. It's a great pleasure to start on this highly relevant and important issues for discussion. I believe that migration policies is the most, challenging and important area in today's society, not just in our country, but in most countries. The challenges extend beyond the national borders, and all leaders have a responsibility to work towards a common solution. At the end of 2015, more than 65 million people were forcibly displaced worldwide. European cooperation has developed and deepened over the last 6 years, but last year I think it was confronted with one of its most serious crises ever. The scale of irregular arrivals of migrants and refugees caused large sections of the European population to question their leaders' ability to manage the situation. Many saw the European cooperation as cause of the crisis, not the solution. And I would like to stress that last part because there are two different discussions in Europe going together. One is the discussion on migration, the discussion on refugees, the crisis. The other is about Europe. And in this issue, they were linked so closely together that all of the forces that were both anti-Europe or anti-EU institutions and migration skepticism felt, being on the common ground. Like other European countries, Norway received a large number of asylum seekers in 2015, a total of 31,145 applications. At the same time, we increased the numbers of quota UNHCR refugees that came to our country. The Norwegian asylum system was put to a test as it implemented urgent measures to handle an extraordinary situation. Best efforts were made. Looking back, however, I think we all can see that some things could have been done differently, but when you have an ever-increasing number that comes, it's difficult to keep up with the pace, because it does take time to increase the process for processing, but also the housing and the capability to do things rapidly. Meanwhile, migrant influxes to the European continent remain high. It's difficult to be accurate on the number who have arrived this year because of a lag in registration in a lot of countries. Some estimates are around 1 million people, but probably quite a lot of them came last year and have first been registered this year. But I think we all have to realize that the migrant flows must be expected to continue for some years to come. Both because of the conflicts in the neighborhood of Europe, but also because the increased population in a lot of African countries, where you still don't see an economic development that can cope with giving those young people hope. I have recently returned from New York, where I took part in the high-level meeting to address large movements of refugees and migrants. We agreed to work on a global compact for safe, orderly, regular migration by 2018. The meeting stressed the importance of distinguishing between refugees and migrants who are in need or who are not in need of international protection. We also discussed the need for sound mechanisms to ensure that those in need of protection, as well as better responsibility sharing mechanisms between the countries. I highlighted 4 areas of particular importance for the Norwegian government. And firstly, we must distinguish clearly between refugees and economically motivated migrants. Otherwise, we will undermine our ability to protect those who qualify for protection, and we will undermine the institute of asylum. Secondly, we need closer cooperation on return of people who do not qualify for asylum or protection. Countries must readmit migrants who return home voluntarily or, if we need to, by force. Thirdly, we stress the international law already provides a solid legal framework for protection of refugees. What we need is better implementation of existing instruments and standards. And fourthly, we must address the root causes of migration. Norway will maintain its high level of development assistance with this in view. It's also crucial that we all work together to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. In this effort, closer cooperation between humanitarian and development actors are vital. These were our 4 main topics when we discussed in the high-level meeting. While it's important to distinguish between refugees and irregular migrants, both remain a concern. In our cooperation with third countries, we must take the particular interest of sending, transit and receiving countries into account. In this respect, I also welcome the agreement to make the International Organization for Migration, IOM, as related organization of the UN. The closer relationship between the IOM and the UN will strengthen cooperation and enhance their ability to fulfill their respective mandates, both for migrants and for refugees. It was also underlined in this meeting, a fact that I think we already know, that the refugee crisis is a global crisis that no country or no region can handle alone. The total number of applications for asylum in Norway has been significantly reduced in 2016. This same applies to the other Nordic countries. Nevertheless, migration will continue to affect Nordic society in the future, with ripple effects on politics, policy making, and on academic research. There are differences between the Nordic countries when it comes to migration in terms both of the number of arrivals, their nationality, the type of reception system we have, the education system and processes, integration policies, and public attitudes. But even if we have these differences, there are many similarities. The Nordic countries share a common and long tradition of cooperating on various matters, and our research collaboration on this topic has been particularly rewarding. And although last year's migrant crisis represented a huge challenge, I think, to all of our countries, we have benefited greatly for both the information sharing, the dialogue, and the common policy. There are some specifics that makes our countries, that makes large number of migrant and refugees to our countries a different type of challenge than to others. The Nordic welfare model is dependent on a high level of participation in the workforce. This means that it's essential for migrants to enter the labor market as soon as possible. And the Nordic society also have a highly organized labor market. And I believe this serves us well. It's a big part of the Scandinavian model. With large numbers of migrants arriving in Europe and low return rates for those who are not granted asylum, there is a risk that we will have more people in our societies falling into the hand of unscrupulous employers and into the irregular economy, which compared to most other European countries have been very small in our societies. That's one of the challenges. The second big challenge is, of course, that with the high cost level that the Scandinavian countries have, the qualification needs to get into the labor market is big, meaning that it's more difficult also for those who get a grant and a permit to stay. It becomes more difficult to get integrated into the labor market. But one of the reasons why I have been so clear that we need more effective return policies is that I believe if we don't get that in Europe, we will have a larger informal economy, more people who will be used by organized crime and unserious business, and I think it will change our society in the long run. And I think there's two coins to the side when it comes to being liberal on accepting people to come and seek asylum and to work here. It's the other side is that we must be able to return those who have not the possibility and who will not be allowed to stay. There's also a risk of large group of people becoming dependent on benefits. It gives particular cause for concern if these groups follow ethnic lines. It leads to serious financial and social problems both for the individual concerned and for the families. We see that a growing number of children are living in poor families in Norway, and there's one main reason for that. It's immigration and asylum seekers and people who are newcomers to our society. It's, of course, extremely important that we have good integrational policies to meet this, and integration is a two-coined part two. You need to want to be participating in our society, but the society also needs to open for your participation. And as I said, this is more difficult in our countries because of the skills need in our labor market. If too many stays out of the labor market, tax revenues will be reduced, welfare systems come under pressure, and this is a long-term concern for us. And there are areas in some Nordic cities where living conditions are very difficult, where large numbers of people outside the labor market who scarcely participate in society at all. Some of these areas also have a high crime rate, which affects the residents both directly and indirectly. For example, residents in such areas generally have little confidence in key social institutions. And if there's something the Scandinavian countries can show that it's different from southern European countries, is that we have high confidence in our key institution. It's part of our model. It's part of how our society functions. So when large groups do not have that, it also is an issue that we have to address and discuss how we can change. We urgently need to build a new cohesion, social cohesion, in multi-ethnic societies if we are to meet these challenges. Civil society will have to play a more prominent role in this work. Religious communities, for example, have a key role to play in supporting democracy and human rights. I don't believe we can overcome the refugee crisis by building walls. I believe we should do that by working together on common solutions. In the end, this will be in the best interest of everyone. But I do also believe that we have to be honest about the discussion of the challenges it leads to. Because what's happening in Europe now is that large scales of our population don't believe in the political leadership if they're not addressing issues that they can see in their everyday life. And of course, we are now challenged in a situation where after several years of economic downturn in Europe, you have a large migration crisis at the same time. A lot of people will be easily affected by easy populistic rhetorics on immigration and social issues. It does also partly undermine the political systems in Europe if we don't manage to have a joint and a cooperation that works together to address these issues. And I truly believe that we can have a common Norwegian or Nordic approach to the challenges we are facing, even though for a person who has been Minister of Immigration and Integration in between Bert Haarder in the beginning of the 2000s and Mona Sahlin at the other side, the differences between Denmark and Sweden were quite obvious at that time. I think maybe we are all becoming more realistic, and we are all seeing that there are some challenges that we need today to work on together. I think this conference is an excellent opportunity for us to learn from each other, to exchange information and experience. And then I always have to say, in politics, we believe that we should make it possible to change our societies by operating, but we also have to be connected to the society when we do it. I think that's one of the big issues now, to make sure that we make multi-ethnic societies that we are moving into function together without losing the acceptance of the people and the voters of our countries. I think the challenge is going to be big for all European countries. This is the modern day's most political formative issue that you are addressing on this. And it is, of course, connected to a lot of other issues, but it's extremely important that we try to find good solutions also in the Nordic sense. Work participation is one important issue of this. Also, to say that there are limits to who we can accept come here. If they don't need protection, we might have to be even more restrictive in the years to come. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's very reassuring to see that the Prime Minister has such good knowledge on this topic, and that you are so deeply aware of all the challenges and problems that we have to solve. And we can sit here today and discuss this on a theoretical level. You have to go out there and make politics, and we don't envy you that situation. But as a small token of our gratitude, we have to prepare for winter. Something in English. And then Jon Ropstad will lead you through this first session.
Thank you to Prime Minister Erna Solberg and Director in Fafo, Tone Fløtten. My name is Jon Ropstad, and I'm a Research Director here at Fafo, and I will be the conference host for the rest of the day. And I think that with the political perspective presented and the challenges presented now by Erna Solberg as a point of departure, it is time and a privilege to introduce our keynote speaker, Thomas Gammeltoft-Hansen, who is the Director of Research at Raoul Wallenberg Institute in Sweden. He's also holding an honorary professor at the University of Aarhus in Denmark. And he is a Dane working in Sweden and now giving a lecture in Norway. I mean, he suits very well to address this Nordic perspective. The title of his lecture is The End of Deterrence Paradigm, Future Directions for Global Refugee Policy. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It is indeed an honor to be here. Very happy to see many familiar faces, both among academic colleagues and friends who have been working on these issues for many years. And it's, of course, an honor to address the Prime Minister and other members of the government here today. What I'll be doing today is to try and take a bird's-eye perspective to the situation we're currently facing in Europe and the Nordic countries. And I do believe that there is a strong need for a Nordic and combined Nordic perspective to these matters. In that sense, I'll be following up very closely from the previous remarks. For the past year and a half, I think this is what has been constantly referred to as the refugee crisis. A dramatic increase in the number of asylum seekers arriving in Europe, and a number of related issues in terms of European collapse of Schengen, re-erection of border controls, competition among certain member states in terms of restricting access or making more unpalatable the conditions of stay for arriving asylum seekers in the hope of shifting flows towards neighboring countries. Yet the rise in asylum seekers in Europe is at very best a symptom of the refugee crisis. If there is even a real refugee crisis, it's not a Nordic or even a European one, but a global one. And I think the global numbers confirm this. If you look at the number of forcibly displaced persons and where they're currently hosted at the moment, it shows very clearly that the vast majority of these people remain either in the country of origin as internally displaced, or for 86% of the world's refugees in low and middle income countries. 5 countries combined host 95% of the world's Syrian refugee population, none of them in Europe. So this rising number is, of course, a product of a world with more violent conflicts, rampant discrimination and political oppression. And while there's been much talk about addressing these root causes, which I think is important, quite frankly, we seldom know how. If there's a lesson from the interventionist foreign policy of the past decades, is that we can depose of a dictator by might, but we have very little control of what comes next. It's very often more violence, more discrimination, and the refugee and displacement to follow. But this is only one side of the story, and the rapidly rising number of forcibly displaced persons these last years is one part only. The other side is that refugees are stuck without access to durable solutions. Out of the world's 20+ million refugees, less than 5% found a durable solution last year. And to my mind, that number should concern us just as much as the arrivals of asylum seekers in Europe, because it speaks to a bigger problem and a global refugee policy that is fundamentally failing in terms of addressing this issue in a sustainable manner. And if you've been listening to experts and aid organizations, they've been warning about this situation for years, that countries in the region of origin could not keep up, that refugees could not be expected to live like this forever. And yet for the last quarter century, the primary response, some would crudely say the only, of European and other wealthy states have been to build exactly taller walls and strike more deals with other countries to contain refugees where they are. This is a development that started since the end of the Cold War. We've seen the sort of slow onset of various deterrent policies, and it has gradually become what I would call the dominant policy paradigm for structuring how we as policymakers perceive, analyze, and respond to refugees. And in this case, we're talking about a community of the large donor countries, the richer states, but we're also talking about an increasing number of collaborating transit and origin countries. And are centering around the belief that Europe and other wealthy states can somehow insulate themselves from taking on a more substantive and indeed a proportional responsibility in regard to refugee protection by speculating in the way that migration control is decided designed vis-à-vis international refugee and human rights law. This is not a very palatable approach, as also pointed out, but for quite long, it's been seen as being politically viable and, to be crude, a quite effective response to both the external pressure posted by rising number of global refugees and the internal pressure posed by anti-immigration policies, despite the obvious cost to refugees and overwhelming of third states. As a paradigm, we've also seen how deterrence policies have continued to develop in order to respond to different challenges. So, new techniques in terms of irregular movement, the rise of the human smuggling industry, legal impositions have each sort of also helped push certain developments, which means that we've developed more sophisticated means of control, new technologies, more elaborate bilateral and regional arrangements to have transit and origin states take on a larger part of the responsibility. And, of course, placing migration management at the very top of our foreign policy agendas. And the fact that deterrence has become this dominant frame for political action may also help explain why new deals with third countries, more domestic restriction policies, is the kind of go-to response that a number of states are taking, because this is what we have been developing over time. And it seems to be almost a knee-jerk reaction that one country starts doing this, other countries are following suit. However, the negative consequences of this deterrence paradigm is becoming increasingly clear. And I believe there's mounting evidence that the deterrence paradigm may no longer be workable as a way to structure our political response to the current situation. And I built this argument on several converging challenges to the way that these policies operate. The first of them relates to mounting legal challenges. As mentioned, the majority of the kind of current deterrent migration control policies is based on the assumption that developed states can somehow insulate themselves against responsibility by either shifting migration control or refugee protection elsewhere. Yet this idea that states are somehow allowed to do outside or by proxy what they clearly have committed to prohibit at home as a matter of human rights and refugee law is increasingly difficult to uphold. We've seen a huge onset in terms of jurisprudence on the nature and scope of both extraterritorial and now also increasingly shared responsibility. We've seen a number of challenges being brought against some of these current indirect deterrence measures, even things that have been in place for a long time. I'm thinking, for instance, about the recent judgment in the Biao case against Denmark relating to family reunification. And we've seen an increasing number of domestic judiciaries take a stand, both in Europe and elsewhere. We've got the Australian High Court, but we've also have, indeed, something like the Greek Refugee Appeals Board striking down the legality of returns to Turkey under the Turkey-EU arrangement because Turkey was not considered to be a safe country. Of course, one may object that this is a cat-and-mouse game and might just drive things forward even further. We're seeing that also in the changing composition of the Greek Refugee Appeals Boards in attempts to curtail similar powers in our parts of Europe. But it does show us that there are at least some limits to the kind of policies that may be pursued if we are not to disregard law completely. The second, and perhaps more important, is the political challenge. While the number of refugees obviously fluctuate from year to year and currently on a historic high, at least as far as the sort of distribution of refugee protection responsibility goes, it's a zero-sum game. The current deterrent policy have placed an inordinate burden on countries in the region of origin. The numbers bear this out. In the last 20 years, the proportion of refugees in the world hosted by these countries have moved up from 70% to 86%. As mentioned earlier, today, right now, 95% of the world's Syrian refugees are hosted by Iraq, Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, and Egypt. That's not a sustainable system. We have to realize that we're placing a burden on these countries that cannot continue to develop in this manner. There has to be some kind of burden sharing mechanism set in place, or we'd be facing an imminent risk that one or more of these major refugee hosting countries would either A, crack under the pressure, or simply decide enough is enough. Many of these countries haven't even signed the Refugee Convention. And we're seeing the signs of this already with increasing border closures towards the Syrian border in a number of these countries. And what really should be keeping European policymakers awake at night is the risk that one or more countries of the major refugee hosting countries would simply start expelling their existing refugee caseloads, creating a domino effect and leading to completely different number of arrivals in our part of the world as well. Of course, the perception that different and fewer rules apply to European states in this regard, that we're trying to get these states to abide by their commitment while to some extent trying to shirk our own, is also counterproductive in this regard. And we're seeing kind of the imitation policies of similar deterrent measures being taken by many of these states as well. The third challenge relates to costs. There's no doubt that the kind of competition-style unilateral politics that are suddenly resurfacing, which we thought we overcame by Europeanizing the asylum system and asylum policy, has now set us ourselves in a situation where we're seeing more border closures, we're seeing restrictions that impact not just those intended, but very often also other people, that have very tangible economic effects in terms of ability to attract labor, in terms of the cost of reinstalling border controls, and in terms of the indirect cost of such border controls on trade, labor mobility, etc. This is in the billions of dollars, according to most studies, of euros, according to most studies. And then we come to the fourth, and this is perhaps the most urgent challenge, and it relates to effectiveness. Because, of course, for all the billions of euros put into these deals with third countries and sophisticated migration control, it has not stopped a gradual increase in secondary movement. We're seeing a downturn for 2016 compared to last year, but we must recognize that what we also created, in effect, is an innovation race between this human smuggling industry, the creativity of migrants and refugees themselves, and border officials in terms of how to deal with this. So we may see short-term effects, such as the Turkey-EU deal, clearly stemming the flow. I mean, that has to be recognized. Yet, we also have seen a rise in the number of migrant refugees using other routes. So far, not, as it appears, the same populations. But if we take, again, a slightly longer view of this issue, we'll see that every time we've made these efforts to either shut down a particular route or enter into agreement with a specific countries, we may be seeing a short-term effect in terms of stemming that particular route, but smuggling techniques and displacement of migration flows towards alternative routes often significantly, if not completely, undermine this effect over time. A recent study among practitioners in the major refugee hosting countries was asked whether they would expect the number of people moving towards Europe to stem or increase after the Turkey agreement. A staggering 80% expected a huge increase in the coming year, because there's nothing to really address the underlying issues in these countries so far. The last, but not least, is of course the humanitarian implications here. Those were already mentioned, and they are evident. We're not just talking about the numbers of deaths in the Mediterranean, for which 2016 seems to be an all-time high, and the Europe's border in the south seems to account for almost 3/4 of all migrant-related fatalities worldwide. We're also seeing an indirect relationship between these deterrence policies and the increasing risk to migrant lives. When you close down the popular, the safe, the easy routes, provide no alternative access for those legitimately in need of protection, well, you're also forcing people to take more dangerous routes to increase the risk of losing their lives in this way. So in short, I mean, if you look at it, the deterrence paradigm has produced a garbled refugee regime, leaving the vast majority of the world's refugees in a permanent limbo, dependent on aid, feeding a growing transnational human smuggling industry, and forcing more and more refugees to risk their lives at Europe's borders in order to secure access to those rights that international refugee law promises on paper. And in this light, I think the current crisis more than a crisis in terms of refugee numbers and global protection capacity, really represents a crisis in terms of the institutionalized responses so far pursued by states. What we're seeing right now is what the sociologist Thomas Kuhn might refer to as a state of paradigm crisis, a situation where the kind of normal policy making, business as usual, no longer suffices and is increasingly thrown into doubt. And if the challenges to these deterrent measures continue to mount, and I believe they will, we may in other words be seeing the beginning of the end for this particular modus operandi of global refugee policy. However, and this brings me to the final point, for paradigm change to occur, crisis is not enough. There must also be a viable alternative around which we can rally and around which policymakers can rally. And that also explains, I think, why we've seen a continuation of kind of business as usual in the kind of policies pursued. Right now, we've got a range of more or less developed alternative ideas and policy frameworks currently competing, though so far none of them appear to have gained sufficient traction to initiate an actual paradigm shift. But recognizing this as a case, as an instance and point in time where we're faced with a situation of paradigm change may actually help guide and structure that process. And at the very minimum, any new policy approach must have to address the fundamental challenges facing the existing situation. The good news is that many of the tools are already there. And by and large, at least at the overall level, we know what the building blocks of a reformed refugee policy need to evolve around. I'm not going to go too much into this because it will be addressed in several of the panels coming after me. But in short, I believe such a reform must evolve around 4 areas. The first of these is continued respect for normative structures. If there was one thing that the UN summits that your Prime Minister attended got right, it was to stand firmly behind the continued relevance and respect for the Refugee Convention. International law, to be frank, is not really the problem here, and hence reforming the Refugee Convention is much less likely to serve as a solution. The criticism that has been launched also from my own native country, Denmark, against the Refugee Convention is largely misguided. You'd be very hard-pressed, I'd venture to say, to find any other human rights instrument that leaves so much flexibility in terms of how states can organize themselves in their domestic refugee status determination procedures. And that is most fundamentally sensitive to states' security concerns in terms of who are actually admitting what kind of rights are expected to be upheld at the outset, and so on. The second, and perhaps most obvious, has to do with international burden sharing, or solidarity, as we are now supposed to call it. Again, we can discuss how to organize this, which principles around which such a solidarity should be founded. But it must necessarily involve not just financial solidarity, but also some kind of concrete commitment to create legal pathways for refugees in the region of origin, and hence alleviate just a bit of the pressure that these countries are currently faced with. The tools are there. We know that humanitarian visas might work for a limited number of people. We know that resettlement will be an important tool for this. And the United Nations Secretary General got it right in calling for a larger commitment to resettlement. And hence it's also somewhat disappointing to people like me that this part of the summit conclusions ended up being a little watered down in terms of having no concrete commitment in terms of how many the wealthier countries would resettle each year. A third and equally important component of reform is to get past what I would call the current container approach to refugee protection. And this is crucial if we want to break the current pattern of secondary movements. Refugee protection cannot be put down simply to be something about non-refoulement and ensuring physical safety. It must also address the wider spectrum of socioeconomic rights. Refugee needs change over time. What we know from studies carried out amongst those refugees who've been arriving within the last 1.5 years is that 2 of the main drivers for doing so was lack of livelihood opportunities and lack of education. In other words, lack of any prospect for a future for themselves or their children. And here again, however, various pilot projects show that this is a problem that can be overcome, that the major refugee hosting countries may gradually open up their labour markets if, and only if, the international community also helps create those job opportunities. And hence that wider foreign policy instruments, such as trade and waiving import tariffs, are just an important tool when it comes to ensuring refugee protection. And last but not least, the European and I think particular Nordic challenge also relates to integration. It was also mentioned by the Prime Minister. And there are claims that the Nordic model does not lend itself easily to integrating newcomers. This is only partly correct, in my opinion. At the same time, studies show that groups of refugees fare markedly different depending on which country they arrive to. And over time, depending on what reception conditions, what possibilities for movement, requalification, and other initiatives are put in place. So, of course, links back to some of the current deterrent initiatives as well. We need to critically evaluate the kind of economic and medium to long-term impact of lack of access to family reunification, shortened one-year stays, distribution policies, lack of access to labour markets, etc., etc. And again, there's a number of interesting pilot projects, some of which also implemented by some of you, going on in different Nordic countries that hold a potential for changing this status quo. And each of these components to a reform are interlinked. It's quite impossible to imagine countries in the region of origin to continue to provide protection to a significant part of the world's refugees without some form of meaningful burden sharing. And unless refugee protection comes to mean more than a life on typically insufficient aid and with no prospect for future, we will continue to see large-scale secondary movement to also Europe. So no matter what your political starting point is, and I think this is the crucial point, it is in our self-interest to change this system. To conclude, this issue is now finally getting the political attention it needs. Yet, we're not there in terms of finding a sustainable response to global refugee crisis. And there's a constant risk of slipping back into these more insular and counterproductive policies. What's important to realize is that this situation, what we are facing right now, cannot be solved by patches or quick fix solutions. What we do need is a genuine paradigm change in our approach to global refugee policy, one based on self-reliance and burden sharing as opposed to containment and deterrence. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for a very stimulating key lecture here today. And I would say that this has been a perfect start, very challenging, and I would very much like to open for questions, but we don't have the time. If you can see the program, it's quite heavy, but there will be breaks, and then you can ask Thomas and so on. But as a small gift from us, here. Oh. For you as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we should now introduce a new session. And the next session is called Europe as Destination, Europe Migration Management. And to share the session, we have Brita Sydhoff, who is the former director of the International Rehabilitation Council for Torture Victims. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Very much. Thank you very much, and good morning again, everyone. It's lovely to be here in Oslo. I am a Swede, having worked in Denmark and for Norway, so we are truly a Nordic group, partly here today. I'm pleased to introduce, on my far left, first of all, Katja Franko, who is a professor at the Department of Criminology and Sociology of Law of the University of Oslo. Secondly, Anette Brunovskis, who is a researcher here at Fafo. And thirdly, my colleague from the board of NIM, the New Institution for Migration and Asylum Policy, Helgi Gunnlaugsson from the Department of Sociology, where he's a professor at the University of Iceland. We have about 1 hour, and I'm going to later open the floor.
We will proceed in the following way, that we have a speaker here who will speak for about 20 minutes, following with Anette and then Helgi, and then we will have at least, I think, 20 minutes to 15 minutes for questions and remarks from the floor. So please, Katja, you begin.
Thank you. Hello. Thank you very much for the invitation. I think I'll go straight to the case, and my case will be a bit different than the previous ones, which means that I will begin very concretely at the border. I will talk about the findings of a research project that we have been doing together with my colleagues at the University of Oslo on border controls. It's called Crime Control in the Borderlands of Europe. And I will start, we talk to many people who do border control in their daily practice. Many of them Norwegian officers, police officers, Frontex officers. And I would like to start by presenting to you some quotes, their experiences of working at the border. Here is one officer who says, well, he worked in Greece. He was a Frontex team leader. He says, well, after I would say, without bragging, I would say that things have become much better. Because we pointed out, when we started coming to Greece, we pointed out that conditions were terrible for the migrants. It was like watching, it is terrible to say it, but it was like watching a war movie from 1943, just like that. It came close to concentration camps, and we wrote a lot about it. What has happened now is that they have expanded the camps. They have gotten in, among other Médecins Sans Frontières, nurses which are in the area, and the threshold for being sent to a hospital is quite low. So I have to say that if Frontex hadn't been there, this would never have happened, never. So one can criticize as much as one wishes, but things have become better, I would say. So this officer, he at least is possible that he is positive that he is making a better contribution. Others were not as positive. One said, the most challenging part for me was that I talked about earlier. Well, it was so bad that my thoughts went back to the dark sides of our European history. I began to reflect over, these are very personal thoughts, but I thought about those who were participating under Nazism, who were involved. What were they thinking, the same as I am now? Did they try to find a way to justify it? Did they understand what they were doing was wrong? Is it wrong? Should we be involved in this? Should we not be involved? I have a very large apparatus guarding my back, which in a way supports me that this is good. But then you see, in a way, at least I see, that nothing happens. What's the point? Many such things. This part has been a challenge, and we talked a fair amount about it down there, not exactly with the same perspective, but about whether it was right for us to be involved. Are we contributing to something good, or are we just helping Greece to do something wrong? I hope that my children and grandchildren can look back on what their father and grandfather did as something that was right, that he did something good, that this will not be a shadow in European history that I have contributed to. I really hope so. And I think these thoughts, not just experiences, which clearly connect the experience at European borders to previous periods in European history, and there were several officers who made these analogies, but also a question, what are we doing now? Are we creating a shadow in European history, and how will our children look back at this time? I think that these are very timely questions coming from officers working on the ground and having to deal with the policies that we are debating today in their everyday lives. They are tasked with implementing them. And what is interesting here is that borders are often talked about in language of humanitarian help. We talk about helping refugees, helping torture victims, war victims. There's a lot of compassion, actually, when we talk about borders. We use the language of humanitarianism. And however, this compassion and empathy as Didier Fasson has pointed out in his illuminating book, very seldom actually translate into a language of justice and rights. And rights are much more difficult to give than compassion. Compassion is actually quite cheap. When we talked about people working on borders, saving lives was actually quite important to them. Here is a Twitter message from the Norwegian officers working on a ship called CM Pilot, where they reported this year that our personnel has saved 14,000 lives so far in 2016. Now, we heard earlier that this year will probably be again a record year when it comes to border deaths. Yet, often borders are justified, the control of borders is justified with the language that lives are actually being saved. When we talk to people tasked with controlling the borders, the impossibility of actually counting border deaths was always an answer. European states do not systematically count border deaths. This is now sort of left to NGOs. IOM is counting now, but it is not an official task of European states. And as Peter Andreas and Greenhill point out in their book on what is being counting and how death is being counted, they say in practical political terms, if something is not measured, it does not exist. If it is not counted, it does not count. If there are no data, an issue or problem will not be recognized, defined, prioritized, put on the agenda and debated. And border deaths are actually not officially counted. We talked to a Frontex officer in the leadership of Frontex responsible for the analysis, and Frontex counts many things. They count irregular border crossings, they count how many false passports they find, how many, all different kinds of things that you can imagine related to the border, but they do not count border deaths. And the officer said, we were thinking some time ago that we should start it counting, but at that moment it was too early. But especially now that the Eurosur is becoming, and one of the main purposes for Eurosur is to prevent the loss of life. Eurosur is a surveillance system. So we thought that we should perhaps establish something more systematic, of course. Eurosur research should provide opportunity for that. It is important, of course. And also, to a certain extent, an issue related to land borders. There are areas which are mountainous, and with the circumstances, we can see people dying, or sometimes there are floodings and all that, so it is important. But we do not do it systematically at this stage, but our intention is to start taking action on that. So what is happening here? Is Europe, our European countries, actually averting the sight from the costs of border control? And also, which other costs are we not discussing here? When we talk about effective returns, when we talk about effective border control policies, what I would like to talk about today is actually how is this actually being done? What kind of institutions, what kind of measures are being used for this purpose? This is a picture of Trandum, which is not a prison, although people who are being placed there are officially it's officially called imprisonment. They get an imprisonment decision. And as a criminologist, before doing this project, I was doing other types of forms of crime control. And for most people, this institution is almost undistinguishable from a prison. It has been expanded considerably in recent years. And in our project, we termed this type of control, border control, actually not only migration control, but crimigration control, because migrants are basically being controlled with similar measures as criminal offenders. They're being controlled as might call it crimigrants. And the conditions there are actually often quite similar. Here is a report from the Parliamentary Ombudsman, who is the institution responsible for oversight and prevention of torture in Norwegian prisons and other institutions, which reports one of the main findings during the visit, which was in 2015, was excessive attention to control and security at the expense of the individual detainees' integrity. Many of the detainees felt that they were treated as criminals, even though they had not been convicted of a crime. Several described the humiliation of undergoing a body search on arrival and after all visits. The body search entailed the removal of all clothing, and the detainee had to squat over a mirror on the floor so that the staff could check whether they had concealed items in the rectum or genital area. The detainees perceived it as especially upsetting that a full body search was conducted after all visits, even when staff members had been present in the room during the visit. Many were also frustrated that they were not given access to their mobile phones and that they were locked in their rooms during evenings, at night, and for shorter periods during the day. The detention center uses largely the same security procedures as the correctional services, including procedures for locking detainees in and out of their rooms, the use of security cells and solitary confinement, and room searches. In some respects, as in the case of full-body searches after visits, the procedures appear to be more intrusive than in many prisons. So what I'm talking about here is the concrete measures that European states, in this case Norway, are using to implement border control, to implement what is being discussed in this room as effective returns. They do have a cost. And these effective returns have been growing. We have seen a remarkable growth in expulsions from Norway. These are statistics both for immigration offenses. This is people who have a negative decision on their asylum case, dark columns, or people who have been convicted of a criminal offense. And this is, you could say, part of a global regime where European countries are then sending back, exporting the unwanted populations from their area. And Norway is actually quite, you might call it a leader in this case. These numbers are difficult to compare. My colleague Sigmund Buchmann has been part of a comparative project who has tried to do that. And we can see that especially when it comes to enforced removals, Norway is actually very effective, more so than, for example, Sweden or the United Kingdom. In absolute numbers, Norway deported last year 7,825 in enforced returns. Sweden, for example, according to the numbers for 2014, even though with much larger migratory burdens, and we see that there is a very strong political pressure to return people, to actually execute negative decision. One of the police officers we talked to described it as a snowball which is just rolling and rolling. So the effective return policy is basically transforming the Norwegian police as it is. The Norwegian Police Immigration Unit has grown from 135 employees in 2004 to almost 1,000 in 2016. It is the second largest unit. It is half of the size of the Oslo Police District, larger than Police Organized Crime Unit. It is larger than any other police district in Oslo. And it has been also allotted a lot of resources. These costs, return costs, and not only human costs, but also in monetary terms. And this is expected to increase to 9,000 persons this year. As one of the police officers that we talked to in Oslo Police District described it, it may lie in the nature of a right-wing government that they have a big focus on this deportation, perhaps a bit bigger focus than other parties. And the Progress Party was, after all, one of the drivers behind the increase of resources to the Oslo Police District. They have found out that there are many foreigners staying illegally in Norway, and we wish especially those who commit crime and who stay illegally in the country not to be here. It costs quite a bit to have illegals, persons illegally in the country who commit crime. Now, what I would like to focus now is on the language that we use here, that is being used, where the persons who commit crime and persons who stay illegally in the country are sort of being talked about in similar terms, they're talked about as illegals. And it contributes to a sort of conflation of immigration and criminality. And this is what you could term is a dangerous migrant logic, that migrants are, in a sense, a danger to the European societies and that they are intrinsically associated with criminality. Because how come otherwise we could use the measures that we usually use on criminal offenders, locking people up, using excessive policing on these populations which basically are in need of protection? And as Paul Duchamp has said, within the EU policy context, irregular migration remains largely viewed as a security concern that must be stopped. This is fundamentally at odds with the human rights approach. And criminalization, you could say, is always a political choice, is one of several choices. It is a choice what kind of measures are being used, and European countries are making these political choices now. And I would suggest that the use of the language of crime supports and legitimizes a production of coercive and punitive regimes and interventions, because these kind of measures are morally uncomfortable. And the first two quotes from police officers that I presented in the beginning show the moral discomfort that is being used when these kind of measures are applied. And I would say that this conflation of the talk of migration and criminality, in some sense, eases this discomfort. Now, at our project, we did actually, one of our colleagues did a study of asylum seekers' criminality, and we found that it is a very, very minor problem. Again, data is difficult to find, but it's not more than 2% probably of registered criminal charges. Yet the criminal asylum seeker has large media presence and political one. And this moral discomfort is particularly clear when it comes to children. The Ombudsman's report described Trondheim as not a suitable place for children. This is a place where families are being placed before they're being sent out of the country. It is a place where there was reported in the period when Ombudsman looked into, there were 18 suicide attempts and attempts of serious self-harm. And the report was very clear that this is not a place where children should be placed. And children, of course, are the difficult, often the ones that really show why this is such a morally uncomfortable, these are practices. It was the image of Alan Kurdi that woke Europe to compassion some time ago. And several of the officers we talked to found it particularly difficult when the question of children was discussed. Here is one officer who reports, people lived in several floors with poor access to water. Yes, they got food and some medical supervision eventually. It came after we arrived. This is in Greece. And I will never forget, there was a father, the cells were dark, there was clothing hanging out to dry in front of the windows and stuff. It was like coming to the Middle Ages, with a 2-story grid in the front, and there was a father with his daughter, or maybe 3 years, in his arms. She was wearing one of those small pink jogging suits. Inside, there was chaos, crowded with people. And the only thing he says is, please help me. This made an impression on me, and it is still here, that image, because he was, in a way, a symbol of what these people wanted from me while we were down there. And this is part of the debates that Norway has experienced when it comes to children. How can a country with a humanitarian self-perception coexist with its urge to deport and expel, especially when it comes to expelling children? However, at the same time, we are still seeing a continued political pressure towards the same policies. Here is a Norwegian minister discussing possibility of establishing so-called care centers for minors in Afghanistan, saying, this is my translation, if we establish care centers in Afghanistan, more unaccompanied minors will be able to receive a negative decision so that we can return more. This is the case for those who get a resident permit today because they do not have access to adequate care in Afghanistan. Precisely those will get adequate care in the center if we succeed. So how can, in a sense, this wish to help children, the empathy that we feel towards them, coexist with the policies that are basically doing something of the opposite? And I will show you one quote from Frontex. This is from their official brochure. Again, a report from a rescue mission. I was on mission last week. It was Force 8 to Force 9, thunderstorm with hail. We got the call that there was a search and rescue case. We started looking just as the weather got very bad. Out of 12 people who were reported missing, 8 of them had been washed dead onto the shore. Among these, there was a 7-year-old girl. This girl had been promised heaven in the European Union, but she had been cheated of her life. She paid to be dead. The facilitators, the people traffickers, left her to die. It is very painful, very distressing. So we see here Europe, or in case of Frontex, showing empathy to a child, a 7-year-old girl, yet at the same time placing all the blame for her death on evil people traffickers, on criminal networks, rather than looking at sort of more substantive issues. And I think this creation of criminal immigrants or criminal traffickers who are in a way can be blamed for the possibilities for the situation here is an important turn which sort of enables coexistence of border control policies which are often could be described as quite inhumane with sort of a self-perception that we still have that we are doing something humanitarian. It's a process of transforming basically migrants from victims to offenders. And you might remember the incident in Cologne at New Year's Eve about a year ago, which sort of turned Germany, and you could say quite a lot of Europe also, in terms of public sentiments towards Syria and towards the policy of open borders. Where basically what we are outsourcing is not only, as the previous speaker talked about, sort of the practical responsibility for border control on countries like Turkey, but I think we're also outsourcing the moral responsibility for the hardship which is being produced at the border on people. They can either be blamed themselves or the criminal others. And I think I will conclude here. What I presented here is basically issues of morality, or you could call it immorality at the border. Because control of borders are an essential prerogative of state sovereignty, but borders imply a use of force. And when states use force, at least European states are depending that this use of force is legitimate. And the question is, of course, to what extent can the system be legitimate and moral when it is producing such deep moral discomfort when it is being practiced on the ground? And I think this is perhaps a question for debate, but I think a question when it comes to the Nordic context here is that Nordic countries are sometimes being branded as sort of moral superpowers. And I think a question is, of course, whether the asylum policies are in danger of ruining the brand. I think I'll conclude here.
Thank you so much, Katja. We'll proceed with Anette straight away. Thank you.
Thank you. Any situation that creates vulnerability also creates the potential for exploitation, and by implication, also for human trafficking. Since 2005, most European countries have agreed on a specific framework for human trafficking policy that aims both to criminalize and prosecute human traffickers and to protect its victims through the Council of Europe Convention on Actions Against Human Trafficking. During my allotted time here today, I want to take the opportunity to show you some pictures while I speak. And these pictures very clearly remind us who we're talking about, the refugees and migrants of the world. And also, as our keynote speaker spoke about that, and pointed out that this is a global crisis, it's not a European crisis. These pictures were very kindly lent to me by the outstanding photojournalist Peter Biro, who for the past decades has documented some of the world's most pressing humanitarian crises. And in these pictures you will see refugees in Indonesia, Somalia, Pakistan, Iraq, South Sudan, and the Central African Republic. So I will talk about the paradox in how the human trafficking term and trafficking policy framework has been simultaneously been overused and underused in the handling and discussions, particularly of last year's refugee and migrant situation, but also how this is an ongoing issue. On the one hand, the human trafficking term is often used imprecisely in referring to all movement of people, for instance, across the Mediterranean, rather than in many cases more appropriate human smuggling or for that matter, the more neutral facilitation. On the other hand, the human trafficking term and framework is underused when it comes to actual victims' rights. These rights are regulated through the Council of Europe Trafficking Convention and include the rights to being identified as a victim. It includes rights to protection and rights to temporary residence permits, or a so-called reflection period. To elaborate on that first part, or the conflation of smuggling and trafficking, when human smuggling is labeled as human trafficking, it shifts the understanding of who is the victim. What is being violated in human smuggling is the border by those who move across it. But who is being violated in trafficking is the vulnerable individual. So actions against human smuggling can be understood as the state protecting its own borders against those who seek to enter illegally and those who facilitate that entry. But in actions against human trafficking, the state can be understood as primarily protecting vulnerable individual victims. And this undoubtedly for many holds a different moral value and also an urgency. And as Katja just talked about, it also shifts the responsibility for the horrors that have taken place to faceless criminals and relieves state policies from responsibility. So it is against this backdrop that the conflation of smuggling and trafficking must be seen. It lends a different moral value and a humanitarian tint to actions that aim to stop migration. And this was, for instance, prominent in discussions about NATO's involvement in the Mediterranean. For instance, the US Secretary of State, John Kerry, was quoted as using the terms illegal migration, human smuggling, and human trafficking completely interchangeably. My second point, and the second part of the paradox, is the simultaneous underuse of the trafficking framework when it comes to the protection of victims. Even though the European policy framework focuses both on the prosecution of traffickers and on the protection of victims, in practice, actions against traffickers are generally prioritized, and less efforts are put into identification and protection. I'm currently involved in a project with the Nexus Institute in the US and the NGO Athena in Serbia to examine the experiences of frontline workers and what can be learned from these experiences in terms of securing identification, assistance, and protection. And I'm actually going to Belgrade next week to continue our discussions on this topic. And I want to share with you some of the observations that organizations working with refugees in the Balkans have made during the last year's crisis. With the drastic increase in the numbers of refugees coming from Greece into Macedonia and Serbia, local institutions and organizations faced great challenges in meeting even basic needs. And Serbian and Macedonian anti-trafficking NGOs had their mandate expanded by local authorities to work with the newly arrived and the transiting refugee and migrant populations. They reported very worrying observations of cases of deep vulnerability, exploitation, as well as notable numbers of cases of human trafficking in these populations. At the same time, there was an almost complete lack of appropriate screening mechanisms to identify trafficking cases and assess trafficking risk. And policies passed during this time also increased vulnerability and decreased chances of identification of victims. So, for instance, Macedonia at one point passed legislation that allowed refugees to pass through the country in 72 hours, essentially pushing the refugees north without offering any protection or any intervention, and with no effort being made to screen for trafficking or other vulnerabilities. In some of the specific cases of trafficking, the exploitation started either in the country of origin or during transit. So, for example, one family was held hostage by smugglers who demanded ransom from their family back home. And during their captivity, the women and girls were systematically raped. In another case, a man had sold his kidney while in transit in order to finance the smuggling of his family out of a dangerous area. However, what was also central in the observations of the NGOs was that vulnerability to trafficking was not only a question of exploitation during or before transit, but also vulnerability and exploitation that happened after arrival in Europe, and in which the smugglers / traffickers, whatever they're framed as, had no part. So, for instance, one woman who had left her country in Africa and made it to Greece was forced into prostitution there. She arrived in Macedonia pregnant and was not screened by the authorities in spite of trying to relate her situation. One man had been trafficked for agricultural labor in an attempt to make money to move on. And there have been many worrying reports about abuse and exploitation, for instance, of children who are not taken care of. So my point here is that if anti-trafficking efforts are to be effective, they need to address vulnerabilities created also after migrants arrive. And these vulnerabilities are often created by policies within Europe and policies of migration control. And if human trafficking is so widespread as to warrant large-scale naval operations of interception, we should also expect to have seen an explosive increase in the number of assisted victims and in funding to such assistance. And this we have not seen. I'm being told that my time is up, so I will stop there and thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Anette. And now to Helgi.
Thanks. It's a great pleasure being here. Migration and refugees is nothing new in our history. In a way, we Europeans are all migrants and refugees. The only question is when we migrated. Some of us a long time ago, and some of us more recently. Millions of Europeans, including Scandinavians, flocked to North America in the late 19th century. searching for a better life. As a case in point, Iceland, up to 20% of the whole population in Iceland, members of my father's family included, migrated from Iceland to Canada and North America just before the 1900. And they built a new life in a new country, and we still have ties with some of them today. And why did they leave Iceland? It was due to a number of factors that all sound familiar to our present-day problems of migration and refugees. Overpopulation in Iceland, economic hardship, lack of work opportunities, no space to build a home, difficult natural conditions, because many parts of Iceland at that time did not even experience any summer many years in a row. So they had to migrate, against their own will for the most part, as our modern-day refugees and migrants experience. They had to leave what they knew for something utterly unknown to them, being poor without any means to prosper. But we now know that this ended as a successful story, for the most part because of a welcome culture of the hosting countries. And now we've been facing nothing less than a human catastrophe in our part of the world. We've not seen since World War II. Millions have been escaping wars in Syria, Iraq, Ukraine, and other parts of the region where their lives are in danger. Many have experienced traumatic situations, both in their home countries and on their way to Europe. What about our reactions in Europe? Well, they have been kind of mixed. Some nations have been more open to fugitives than others. Not to mention the USA, which almost kind of wants to just shut its door. But too seldom do we face our own responsibilities for the ongoing crisis. Military interventions have been frequent from the West during the past 2 decades, and without any doubt contributed to the crisis we are facing now. As for Iceland, as an example, I come from Iceland. We are members of NATO. We supported the bombing of Iraq in 2003 by joining the League of Coalition of the Willing. And we have supported both military actions in that region, and we have also supported humanitarian actions as well. Therefore, we cannot simply be innocent bystanders to the current migration crisis, and we have to share the obligation with the rest of the Western world to meet the needs of the people who are fleeing wars and disorder. And to be fair, we have tried, Iceland included, we have really tried to face these consequences. Yet, we and Europe have perhaps been more occupied with the deterrent principle, that Thomas was talking about here earlier this morning. We've been more occupied with protecting our borders to limit immigration than with welcoming refugees and providing protection and humanitarian aid. And by concentrating so much on control, we risk ignoring progressive human rights principles that we have adopted and we are so proud of. Charters of fundamental human rights, protecting dignity, protecting children, which comprise, by the way, the majority of refugees. And we are acting almost as these principles only apply to ourselves in our privileged world of the West, but are not universal human rights principles applying to all. But let us turn to Iceland, where I come from, just to put this all in perspective, the immigration picture. For us, we have seen dramatic changes taking place with immigration in Iceland in recent years. In 2000, only 16 years ago, we only had about 2% of our population being foreign-born. But now it has jumped up to 8%. So it's quite a lot of jump. And this is, of course, driven by the needs of an expansive economy. On top of this influx, we have in most recent months experienced record high numbers of asylum seekers, in great numbers from nations like Albania and Macedonia, which we have defined as being safe states. And this has put a lot of strain on our infrastructure in Iceland to process these cases according to our own legal provisions and international legal obligations that we are part of. And at the same time, we have seen interesting population surveys in Iceland, initiated one by Amnesty International, of positive attitudes towards refugees, both in Iceland and worldwide. In Iceland, for example, showing that the vast majority of the public supports more international protection of refugees, that the Icelandic government should do more than they are doing to assist refugees, and most importantly, more than 2/3 of the Icelandic population have said that they wanted refugees to live in their neighborhood, and 13% said they were positive toward accepting them to stay in their home. And even kind of more encouraging for Iceland is that we have not yet, at least, seen a rise in right-wing populist groups flirting with racism, as we have seen here in Scandinavia, not to mention in France, Holland, and Austria. And at a time when Iceland is enjoying economic expansion and labor shortage, currently we are importing foreign labor by the thousands each year, we seem to be a nation with all the conditions to receive more refugees and more immigration than we are doing today. At least not less than Sweden and Germany, for example, to share the burden, as also Thomas mentioned earlier this morning, to share the burden of this immediate European and global crisis that you're facing today. Well, my field is criminology, and the refugee crisis certainly has criminological dimensions. Refugees routinely become victims of crime both in their home countries and on their way to Europe, where they are exploited by smugglers and sent on unsafe boats where great many of them have lost their lives in the Mediterranean. Fear of crime committed by refugees has also been a great concern among many of us in the West. We've seen sensational reports about crimes committed by immigrants, and it was just mentioned here earlier this morning also about the colon in Germany. And also, not to forget, the fear of terrorist acts, which we have unfortunately experienced in recent months. And in these horrifying cases, we seem, though, to have more residents of the host countries than refugees being the perpetrators of these acts. Still, crime and terrorism are real concerns, and they need to be seriously addressed. And of course, crime-prone individuals can hide among refugees, and members of terrorist groups can easily hide in the flood of refugees to the West. Yet, we have to keep in mind that if we do not take serious steps to help refugees, to provide humanitarian aid and protection, to help them integrate in their receiving host countries, we risk creating groups of immigrants, legal or illegal, who will adopt criminal lifestyles and hostility towards others. Therefore, there is a lot at stake for us in solving the migration crisis successfully. to help those who have fled, integrating them to our part of the world. But at the same time, we do our best to stop the war and disorder in that region and the Middle East. But we have to do it through peaceful means, by all means. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Helgi. That was a powerful ending. While you all gear up for comments or questions, I have one question to the panel, and I don't know which person would like to answer that. Have we come to the end of a free Nordic movement? This was one of the cornerstones of, the whole collaboration when I was young, to be able to move around in the Nordic countries. And of course, then came the whole European Union. Have we seen the end of this now? And at the same time, you have the microphone, so whoever of you, just signal to me if you want to speak. Who would like to answer?
Well, Katja, you just mentioned that the Nordic nations are the moral superpowers of the world. Is it still there?
Well, I think what we're seeing is that Nordic countries, like all European countries, are playing a game. Sometimes it's called sovereignty game, which basically means that you try to sort of prioritize your own interests and sort of push the burdens on others. And in that sense, you could say that the Nordic countries are, to some extent, no longer playing as a team, but rather as individual players, in the sense that they feel that it's suddenly, if Denmark closes the borders, or if Norway closes the borders, then the burdens will be on Sweden or vice versa. So in that sense, you could say that there isn't a Nordic team. There are individual countries which are playing their own game. But they do, I think, have a sort of shared interests and sort of also a shared history. And there is a lot of, just this meeting is a testimony to that there is a lot of common cooperation going on. At the same time, one shouldn't forget the differences between the countries, which were also mentioned earlier. Yes.
Anyone else of you would like to comment?
I think that we should try to really to unify our approach to this migration crisis in the Nordic nation. I think we have a lot in common, but I think we lost our way somehow in the past maybe 10, 20 years. But I hope that we are reunifying as a core, because I think we can do a lot more in common than as individual players.
Thank you. The word goes to Trygve Nordby. Would you please introduce yourself when you speak?
Sure, thank you. I'm Trygve Nordby. I work for the city of Oslo at the moment. I've had about 25 years of experience from different, different viewpoints and different institutions in this field of migration. So my question goes both to this panel but also to the opening remarks, because my basic problem is to understand what is new. What is new? When we have numbers referred to, let me tell you that the UNHCR numbers in 1994 were 15.7 million refugees. Today it's 16.1. We had more or less the exact same number of refugees back in 1995. When we look at, maybe it's migration at large, if we look at OECD numbers, in 2007, 4.8 million people, 4.7 million people immigrated into the OECD countries. Now it's exactly the same number. So in the large numbers, in the movement of large numbers, we don't have that much more migration in relative terms, and we have definitely had more or less the same numbers of refugees. So I also have a critical remark to this constant use of 63 or 60 plus million refugees, including IDPs, internally displaced people. without discussing them. 40 million was mentioned, but we don't discuss them. And we also include the Palestinians under the UNRWA mandate. They are constant. They grow by the numbers of kids in fourth and fifth generation. So the number of refugees isn't that much larger. My question is then, what causes the crisis? Why do we call it a crisis? Is it the media? Is it the growth of right-wing movements? Have we reached a point of, how can I say, compassion fatigue? Numbers from Iceland shows the opposite. We know that in most of our countries, the more people are exposed to immigration, the more positive they are to immigration. So what are the driving forces behind this crisis? Is it only a perceived crisis? Are there people out there or political forces that want us to be scared, to feel some kind of uncomfortable, how can I say, to feel that we need to do something beyond what we are slowly building up within the European context? Because at the same time, and we might hear about that later today, we see that the European institutions, they are slowly developing in the right direction. We had a setback in 2015 and 16, but I really would like to challenge the speakers, you in the panel, Gammeltoft-Hansen and others. Is there a crisis? And do you as researchers and we as the public risk going along with this perceived crisis? Why don't we just calm down and have the same discussion as we had in 1995 and 2007?
Thank you, Trygve. I challenge people also from the audience. This is a dialogue. It's not meaning to be question and answer, but it's a very pertinent question. So Thomas or anybody else who'd like to join the dialogue, please go ahead. I think you need a microphone, though.
Thank you very much. You make a very valid point in the sense that there is a bit of sort of a tyranny of numbers, and these numbers are inherently malleable in how you represent them. Of course, your comparison and your sort of comparison year represented another high point in terms of the number of refugees. And I'm not sure that the response was as moderate and quiet and calm in the 90s either. I mean, I remember at least some debates there, but I'm not that old as either. Now, some things have changed. Even if the absolute number of refugees under UNHCR's mandate hasn't changed dramatically, it has gone up quite quickly in recent years. There's no doubt about that. The concentration has become bigger. So in 20 years, we've seen a larger concentration of those same refugees being hosted in fewer countries. That's a big problem. I think that is a crisis in a political sense in terms of distribution, hence my remarks about burden sharing as being in our own self-interest. And we've seen now sort of a chronic underfunding of refugee protection efforts in those same countries, leading to a quite marked increase in secondary movements, which is a more recent phenomenon of the last 1.5 years. Whether that will continue or not, I'm saying it probably will, because we're not addressing the underlying structures, although it has gone temporarily down. Whether you choose to speak of a crisis or not is, of course, also a point of strategy, both as policymakers and as researchers. I've chosen to embrace the word in the sense that I do believe there is a crisis in the way that we're addressing refugee issues that is fundamentally not sustainable, and that will lead to, in my view, and I think the data supports that, continued secondary movements unless we do something more fundamental about it. So that's the crisis I address. And secondly, of course, a crisis in terms of the policy approach, which I think speaks very much to your point as well. I do not believe that there is a European crisis. I don't think there is a global capacity crisis either. Quite frankly, I mean, if we look at the global number of refugees, it still constitutes, 0.06% of the world's population. The amount of money given to UNHCR last year is less than what the American population used on food for Independence Day this year. Just to get that perspective, I'm quite aware of that. But we do have a crisis in terms of how we address it and how we distribute that responsibility.
Katja, you asked for the floor?
Yes, I think perhaps I would like to say something to the second part of the question of what has changed. Because even though you could suggest that the crisis has always been there or has not been there, depending on how you term it, I think the Europe's response is changing. And I think that Europe is changing because of the situation now. That basically perhaps what has changed is the way Europe sees itself, also as an area of free movement of people and as an area of common solidarity. And also how Europe responds to these issues. I think some of the measures that are being used today would have been unthinkable or would be very problematic, and we are just now being sanitized to their use. So I think perhaps Europe is changing more than the situation itself. And I think the argument that also Prime Minister presented today is that we have to manage this effectively in order not to change the Nordic countries because of migration. I think Nordic countries are already changing because of migration, and I think there's something changing in the values that one shows towards issues of solidarity, towards how you deal with, for example, with children and so on. So I think the change is already there, rather than that we should manage migration effectively in order to prevent change.
I would like to make a small comment. I have been working with internally displaced persons for very many years, and I think that one issue that is changing our perception in the Nordic countries is that we know more about internally displaced persons today. And these persons are often in a humanitarian distress, and we know about this via media. And I think this makes us also feel kind of guilty that we know about a crisis in the Sudan, but we don't know how to address it. So I think the whole globalization and the information era, where we know about things that we actually didn't know about 15 years ago even. And it's also, of course, used by the dark forces in our countries to scare us. So I think this is a new phenomenon that is here to stay. Anybody else like to comment this first session? We have about 5 minutes before the coffee and tea break. Anyone? Yes, please. We'll give you a microphone in a minute, just at the very top. Very top. That's fine.
We want to hear.
Wonderful presentation. The issue of paradigm shift, could that be a possibility given that European or our nation's politics is dependent on electoral cycle and governments cannot make decisions without calculating the electoral cycle? How would paradigm shift come given that governments are focused on electoral cycle? And not only the problem of paradigm shift within our government, given also in the international politics, the global kind of new Cold War style competition. I come from Ethiopia. Erna Solberg mentioned about addressing root causes of problems, human rights. Her government dares nothing to say about an ongoing political crisis in Ethiopia, which is the root cause for many people to flee the area. None of the European governments were willing to address the issue of Ethiopian and Eritrean conflict, given Eritrea is one of the countries of origin. So don't you think that we are doomed to suffer this globally and also nationally, given world politics is still wired to think in terms of zero-sum game? We prioritize our interest, not everybody's interest.
Thank you very much for that question. I don't think we're doomed, let me put it that way. And maybe I choose not to think we're doomed. I'm no expert on domestic electoral politics, so I'm not going to go too far into that. But I guess my argument is one of trying to say that on several different levels, I think realities are forcing states' hands. I think what we've been seeing the last 1.5 years is in effect a symptom of a failure to resolve some of these underlying problems 3 years ago, 5 years ago, or even earlier. And if we do not address that, those flows will continue. And that will, as we all know, hugely impact electoral politics. And there's going to be a limit to how many times you can pretend to say that taller walls, borders, or tent camps will actually work in terms of reducing the number of asylum seekers. Again, might do in a short term, very unlikely to do in the medium or long term. So it is more of an elitist rationalist argument, but I do have a belief that those things still somehow factor into this area. When that is said, I think it's also important to acknowledge that we have a bit of a chicken and egg dynamic here. We can pretend that this is an issue that is subject to more fact-based technical solutions, but it is also an issue that drives deep emotional divides that feeds into current trends about a reorientation towards more national conservative things, and that a lot of what's happening also in the EU surrounding asylum and refugee policy tends to be about other things than the refugees and asylum seekers itself. It's about taming domestic fears, or it may be about trying to really, I mean, like the Orban referendum, nothing to do about refugees, everything to do about the Eastern Bloc trying to change or force the European system's hands in how they deal with competence issues.
Thank you, Thomas. Could you please pass the microphone here? We have two last questions. You first, madam. Here, right in the... Here's the mic coming down to you.
Thank you. My name is Marlene Skilbrei, and I'm from the University of Oslo. And I would just like us to invite Anette Brunovskis and Katja Franko to probe a bit more on the function of the victim in kind of serving as a lever for stricter control. Because just point to the parallel that Katja pointed to, how the conflation of crime and immigration makes it possible to institutionalize very different measures. And I think also kind of towards the uneasiness of brute force in the contemporary. That also has to do with being uncomfortable with imprisonment and discomfort with having more of these strict measures unless there is a victim. There's kind of a legitimizing being, acting like a state, doing control in a very concrete sense. So I'm just thinking if you could perhaps kind of comment a bit more on this kind of how this links into discomfort also in domestic affairs, and how the victim became such a powerful tool for quite intrusive measures on many different arenas.
Thank you. We'll take the next question straight ahead, and then you are able to reply, and then we break for coffee, please.
Yeah, it was very interesting. My name is Martin Wies. I work for the international organization in the Netherlands presently. It was quite interesting, this exchange before, but I'm not sure how it related directly to what the panel presented. My question is therefore in line also a little bit with victims and what we heard about them, and it's a very concrete question. In view of the horrors described and the dysfunctionality at the borders, in view of the very nice pictures of victims presented by the second speaker, and in view of the statement that we have in a peaceful way to resolve the problems in the Middle East, the same time Mosul and Aleppo is going on, of course, wouldn't it be the best if we actually started to bring these people out? Then we would cut out the smugglers, we wouldn't have the problems at the borders, etc., etc. What I'm basically implying is, of course, a little bit more of orderly, regulated, actually managed migration as opposed to what's happening. And by the way, in one small sidekick to your presentation, I think it's a stretch, and not because of the figures, to compare the two periods. We didn't have Lampedusa, we didn't have boats we didn't have the European boat people situation as we've had now.
Thank you. Would like to start?
Yeah. Well, these are both excellent and complicated questions, of course. But but there is no doubt that the victim is extremely powerful as an image and as a tool. And I think that this is one of the things that I wanted to speak about in my intervention, is precisely the paradox of how at the same time individuals are elevated to this victim status and sort of being made the target for our humanitarian interventions, and thereby also sort of a tool for demonstrating our goodness and perhaps precisely the discussions that we have in the Nordic countries are also very much about this self-image as fundamentally good people, and so it becomes. It is a huge paradox that precisely these policies then end up actually hurting the people that we claim to help. I think that there is a dishonesty in how these policies are presented, and it's not easily combined. And this is something that I find endlessly fascinating in policies to control and regulate migration. Generally, I have formerly worked also in a project on irregular migration, and where it was very much the same sort of mechanism coming in and explaining and defending very coercive control measures with referencing, for instance, irregular migrant children, that it would be in their best interests to be identified and returned. Right. So, which can certainly be questioned. I think that I don't think I'm answering your question in any particularly satisfactory way, but it's a good
attempt anyway.
Yes, I think perhaps I'll instead of stumbling, I'll give the word to Katja.
Yeah. How about the second question here? Shall we let them out?
Well, I think I'll perhaps try to combine the two questions or link them together, because I think your suggestion would be a sort of an attempt to try to create some order and regularity in a situation at borders which is now really characterized by chaos, which is basically a fight for survival.
Before the borders, in the camps.
Exactly. So in a sense, I think, but the question is perhaps whether this chaos that is characterizing now the migratory journeys is basically also a form of deterrence that Thomas was talking about. And it is, in a way, that the creation of various kinds of victims that are being created on the way is a price that is being paid for this kind of deterrence policies. Because I think the victim here has several roles. One role is then a sort of, also as Anette said, that we are creating ideas about goodness and badness, both our goodness when we help them, and then bad people who are allegedly responsible for the situation. And I think this is very unhelpful. Because ultimately we are creating measures that then also people who are being vulnerable are being subjected to. So we are creating more restrictive measures than that also clearly also children are being subjected to. We are creating dangerous journeys that also anybody is being subjected to. And we know, for example, that women and children have higher mortality rates when it comes to journeys over the sea. We know that they are being victimized and so on. So I think the question is then, of course, why this chaos? Why these chaotic situations that are being created, and what is its purpose, and how could it be elevated to some extent? I think.
Thank you very much. We have to end this session right now because coffee is waiting for us, and we are quite a few people. I don't know if we can say at past we should all be in here for the next session. Good.
Sorry.